The day of the match had started off like any other day in Brazil. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and people all over the country were filled with excitement and anticipation. As the day wore on, the excitement in the air became palpable. Everywhere you looked, people were wearing Brazil's colors, green and yellow, and cheering for their team. The Brazilian team had been playing well in the tournament so far, and the entire nation was behind them. They had already made it through the group stage, and then defeated Chile and Colombia in the knockout rounds to reach the semi-final. Their opponents for the match were Germany, who had also been playing well. But the Brazilian team was confident they had the home advantage, and they knew that they had the talent to win. But there was something strange in the air that day. As the Brazilian players warmed up on the field, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It was as if something was watching them, something sinister. The Brazilian captain, Thiago Silva, tried to shake off the feeling. He gathered his team together and gave them a rousing pep talk, reminding them of the importance of the match and the expectations of the Brazilian people. But even as he spoke, he could see the fear in his teammates' eyes. They were all thinking the same thing: what if they lost to Germany? The German team took to the field, and the Brazilian players couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. There was something about the way the Germans moved, the way they seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else, that made them seem almost inhuman. The match began, and the Brazilian team played with all their heart. But the Germans were relentless, their tactics and skill leaving the Brazilians stunned and unable to keep up. As the minutes ticked by, the fear in the Brazilian team only grew. They were being beaten at every turn, and they couldn't understand how the Germans were doing it. But then something truly terrifying happened. One of the German players, Thomas Müller, scored a goal that seemed to defy all logic. A ball curved in midair, as if being controlled by some unseen force, and sailed past the Brazilian goalkeeper. The Brazilian players looked on in horror, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. And as the Germans celebrated, the fear that had been building inside the Brazilians turned to terror. The rest of the match was a blur of fear and confusion. The Germans continued to dominate, scoring goal after goal, while the Brazilians could only watch in horror. As the final whistle blew and the match ended, the Brazilian team was left in a state of shock. They had been completely outplayed, and they couldn't understand how it had happened. But the fear that had gripped them throughout the match remained. It lingered in the air like a dark cloud, filling the stadium with a sense of unease and dread. In the days and weeks that followed, the Brazilian players struggled to come to terms with what had happened. They were haunted by the memory of that match, by the feeling of being watched and judged by some unseen force. Rumors began to circulate that the Germans had made some kind of deal with the devil, that they had sold their souls for victory. And while most people dismissed these stories as nothing more than superstition, the fear and unease that had taken hold of the Brazilian team could not be easily dismissed. As time passed, the legend of the match only grew. It became known as the miracle of Belo Horizonte, and people talked about it in hushed tones, as if they were afraid to bring up the memory of what had happened. But then, something even stranger happened. People began to report strange occurrences and sightings at the stadium where the match had taken place. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving around the field, while others reported hearing eerie sounds coming from the stadium at night. The rumors only served to fuel the fear and unease that had taken hold of the Brazilian people. Some even began to avoid the stadium altogether, afraid of what they might encounter there. As the years passed, the memory of the match began to fade. But for those who had been there that day, the fear and terror remained as strong as ever. Thiago Silva, the Brazilian captain, had retired from football shortly after the match. He had been unable to shake the feeling of fear and unease that had taken hold of him during the game, and he knew that he could never play at the same level again. Others on the team had similar experiences. Some spoke of feeling as though they were being watched, even when they were alone. Others claimed to have seen strange, shadowy figures moving around their rooms at night. But the strangest stories of all came from those who had been at the stadium on the day of the match. They spoke of seeing ghostly figures moving across the field, of hearing strange whispers and moans coming from the stands. But as he got closer, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving him alone and afraid. The stories continued to spread, and soon the stadium became known as a place of dark magic and terror. People spoke of curses and spells that had been placed on the field, and some claimed that the entire match had been orchestrated by dark forces beyond human understanding. But despite the rumors and legends, life in Brazil continued as usual. The country continued to produce great football players, and the national team continued to compete at the highest level. Yet for those who had been at the miracle of Belo Horizonte that day, the memory of the match would always remain a source of fear and unease. They knew that something dark and sinister had taken hold of them that day, something that could never be fully explained or understood. And so the legend of the match lived on, a cautionary tale of what can happen when fear and superstition take hold of a people. For the Brazilian players who had been there that day, it was a reminder that sometimes, even the greatest champions can be brought to their knees by forces beyond their control.